In the autumn of 1887, across the bone-dry plains of the Dakota Territory, the sound of progress was the rhythmic thud of an axe and the high whine of a saw. Men were raising houses against the vast, indifferent sky, each a testament to ambition and a defiance of the coming winter. They built with logs hewn from the sparse river valleys, stacking them high to create proud two-story structures with steep roofs designed to shed snow. In the small settlement of Prairie Ridge, this was the accepted, the only way. It was the architecture of hope, a visible declaration that a permanent town was being carved from the wild grass. Yet one man, an immigrant named Klaus Richter, did not build up. He dug down. While his neighbors, men like the prosperous and outspoken Marcus Thorne, laid foundations for walls that would reach for the sky, Klaus spent his days with a spade and a wheelbarrow. He excavated a wide, rectangular pit into a gentle, southern-facing slope, hauling out cart after cart of dense, dark earth. The community watched, first with curiosity, then with open amusement. They saw him lining the earthen walls of his pit with field stones he patiently collected from the surrounding prairie, a task that took him weeks of back-breaking labor. He was not building a foundation. He was building a box inside the ground. They called it foolish. They called it wasteful. Marcus Thorne, whose own grand cabin was rising beam by proud beam nearby, would often lean on his half-finished fence and shout over to Klaus. "Building a grave to save the undertaker the trouble, Richter?" The other men would laugh, their voices carrying on the incessant wind. Klaus would simply nod, wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, and continue his methodical work. He was a quiet man, his face weathered from a life spent under an open sky, and he offered no defense against their jeers. His silence was mistaken for shame, but it was, in fact, the deep, unshakable confidence of a man who knew a truth the others could not yet see. As the first frosts silvered the prairie grass, the difference became even more stark. Thorne's house was a skeleton of timber, a monument to future warmth. Klaus's project was a hole in the ground, capped with enormous rough-sawn beams that lay almost flush with the surrounding land. He was creating a roof that was also the ground. The mockery intensified. It was unnatural, they said, a home for a badger, not a man. This communal certainty, this shared belief in the virtue of tall walls and high ceilings, would be tested. It would be shattered by the arrival of a storm that would enter the annals of history, a monstrous blizzard that would later be known as the Schoolhouse Blizzard of 1888. In the face of its terrible power, the proud log homes would become frozen tombs, while the hole in the ground would become a sanctuary. What did this quiet Swiss immigrant understand about thermal mass, geothermal stability, and the unforgiving physics of convective heat loss that everyone else in their confident, conventional wisdom dismissed as the ramblings of a fool? Klaus Richter had not learned his building principles from a book or a university lecture. His knowledge was etched into his memory, a legacy of his upbringing in the high, wind-scoured valleys of the Swiss Alps near the canton of Graubünden. He was born into a world where survival was a direct function of understanding the landscape. As a boy, he had tended his family's small herd of goats, moving them up to the high pastures, the Alps, in the summer. There, they lived not in timber-framed chalets, but in low, sturdy stone structures called Mayenses. These were not grand homes. They were pragmatic shelters, built into the mountainside, often with thick sod roofs that made them seem an extension of the earth itself. He remembered the profound difference between standing outside in a shrieking alpine gale and stepping into the deep, abiding quiet of the Mayenses. The wind did not rattle its walls, it simply flowed over the living roof. The chill did not penetrate its stone and earth structure. It was held at bay by the immense thermal battery of the mountain it was nestled into. His grandfather, a man of few words and profound practical sense, had explained it simply. The mountain has a slow heart, he would say in his thick dialect. It does not race with the summer sun, nor does it freeze with the winter wind. It holds the memory of warmth. You do not fight the mountain, Klaus. You ask for its strength. When Klaus arrived in the Dakota Territory, lured by the promise of land, he was struck not by the opportunity, but by the terrifying vulnerability of the landscape. There was no mountain to ask for strength. There was only the endless horizontal expanse and the sky, which seemed to generate a wind that never, ever stopped. He watched the other settlers build their homes as they had in the more sheltered, forested lands of Ohio or Pennsylvania. They built tall, as if to assert their presence against the emptiness. Klaus saw this not as strength, but as a fatal arrogance. A tall house was a sail, catching the full force of the wind. Its height created a vast interior volume that would be a glutton for firewood. The thin single-log walls, no matter how well chinked with mud and moss, were a poor defense against a cold that he could feel in his bones was of a different, more savage character than even the alpine winters he had known. His conviction was solidified by an encounter in his first spring on the plains. Seeking a better source of stone, he had followed a small, meandering creek farther than usual. There, he came upon a small, temporary encampment of Cree. An old man, who introduced himself with the name Stands Tall, watched Klaus with placid interest. Through a mixture of gestures and the man's limited English, they communicated. Klaus, showing a deep and genuine respect, was invited to share a small meal. He took notice of the elder's winter dwelling, which was now unoccupied. It was not a teepee, but a semi-subterranean pit house, a waskahikan. It was dug several feet into the earth, with a low, mounded roof of logs, hides, and a thick layer of sod. A single, well-placed smoke hole at the peak was its only visible feature from a distance. Stands Tall, seeing Klaus's intense study of the structure, picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. He drew a circle for the sun and another for the earth. He patted the ground. "Warm in winter," he said, pointing down. Then he held his hand high in the air. "Cold." He made a sweeping, howling sound, mimicking the wind, and showed how it passed right over the low mound of his drawing. He then drew a tall, square shape, like the settlers' cabins. He made the same howling noise, but this time he showed the wind hitting the wall, breaking against it, his fingers mimicking drafts pushing through cracks. The lesson was as clear as any architectural blueprint. The earth was a shield. The earth was insulation. The earth held the memory of warmth. It was the same principle his grandfather had taught him, adapted to a new continent. From that moment, Klaus understood. The settlers were building against the prairie. He would build with it. The core principle was staggeringly simple, yet profound. The temperature of the deep earth is remarkably stable. Just a few feet below the surface, the ground remains at a near constant temperature year-round, a reflection of the area's average annual temperature. In the Dakotas, this was roughly 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. While the air outside might plummet to 40 below zero, the Earth just 4 feet down would still be offering up a steady 45 degrees. A conventional house had to fight the full differential, a brutal 100-degree difference between inside and out. A house built into the Earth, however, only had to fight the difference between its desired interior temperature and the ground's stable 45 degrees. It was a battle already half won. This concept, known today as geothermal stability, was the first pillar of his design. The second was thermal mass. The heavy stone walls and the immense weight of the Earth and stone on his roof would act as a heat sink. In the day, the small stove and even the body heat of the occupants would slowly warm the dense materials. At night, as the fire died down, those materials would radiate that stored heat back into the living space, smoothing out the temperature fluctuations. A log cabin with its relatively low thermal mass lost heat almost as fast as the stove could produce it. Klaus's shelter would hold it, cradle it. Finally, he would defeat the wind not by building a stronger wall, but by presenting no wall at all. His home would be aerodynamic, a low mound that the winter gales would scour over, not assault. These were the principles he was staking his life on, the quiet truths he held in his heart while the world mocked him for digging a hole. The construction process began in the late summer, a race against the hardening of the ground. Klaus chose his site with meticulous care, a gentle, south-facing slope that would maximize exposure to the low winter sun and use the hill itself as a natural windbreak against the prevailing northwesterlies. He marked out a rectangle 24 feet long and 16 feet wide and began to dig. The first foot was rich topsoil, which he carefully set aside. Below that lay a thick, dense layer of clay, heavy and stubborn. For weeks, the only sounds from his plot were the scrape of his shovel and the squeal of his wheelbarrow's axle. He dug down 6 feet at the back of the slope and 4 feet at the front, creating a level floor. The excavated earth was piled nearby, a small mountain that would later serve a crucial purpose. Once the pit was complete, he began the walls. This was not the work of a stonemason aiming for beauty, but of a pragmatist seeking stability and mass. He hauled field stones, some as large as a man's chest, using a simple wooden sledge pulled by his lone, aging ox. He laid the largest, flattest stones at the base, directly on the compacted clay floor, creating a footing 2 feet wide. He then built the walls inward, painstakingly fitting the irregular stones together. He did not use mortar in the conventional sense. Instead, he packed the gaps with a dense mixture of the excavated clay, dry grass, and moss, creating a solid, almost monolithic wall that was fused with the surrounding earth. The walls only rose 4 feet from the floor, meaning their tops were level with the ground at the front of the structure and 2 feet below it at the back. To his neighbors, it looked like the foundation for a root cellar, not a home. The most critical and unconventional part of the construction was the roof. Marcus Thorne, who had just finished raising the impressive timber frame of his own second story, scoffed openly at the sight. "Going to cover it with planks, Richter? The first snow will crush you flat." Klaus ignored him. He had purchased 10 massive cottonwood beams, each nearly a foot thick and 18 feet long. Moving them into place was a monumental task for one man. He used a system of levers, rollers, and the patient strength of his ox, grunting and straining until each heavy beam was laid across the stone walls, spaced about 2.5 feet apart. This formed the primary structure of his low, nearly flat roof. Next came the layers of insulation and waterproofing, a process that baffled his onlookers. He did not nail down planks or shingles. Instead, he stretched a layer of thick, heavy canvas, which he had laboriously waterproofed with heated linseed oil and beeswax, across the top of the beams. This membrane was his defense against moisture. On top of the canvas, he carefully placed the topsoil he had first excavated, spreading it into a dense, even layer about a foot thick. This was his living insulation. He then transplanted thick mats of prairie sod onto the topsoil, packing them tightly together. The grass, he knew, would go dormant in the winter, but its dense root structure would hold the soil, and in the spring it would grow, making his roof a living part of the prairie. Finally, over the sod, he laid a cap of thin, flat stones, not covering the entire surface, but arranged to weigh down the sod and provide an additional layer of protection against the elements. The entrance was another point of ridicule. It was not a proud, welcoming door, but a low, heavy door set into a stone-lined passage that angled downwards into the house. To enter, a man of average height had to stoop. Just inside the door, the floor stepped down again, creating a small pit, a cold sink designed to trap any heavy, cold air that managed to seep in. For ventilation and light, he built a single, formidable chimney of stone at the back of the dwelling, which would house the flue for his small cast-iron stove. He also set 2 small, double-paned glass windows deep into the south-facing wall, angled to catch the winter sun. They were more like bunker embrasures than windows, but they were not for the view. They were for capturing precious solar heat. Marcus Thorne articulated the community's skepticism with the authority of a man who had never been proven wrong. "It's a dungeon, not a house," he declared one afternoon to a small audience of fellow settlers. "Mark my words, the first heavy rain will turn it into a muddy lake. The damp will get into his bones and sicken him by Christmas. And where's the dignity in it? A man's home is his castle. He stands tall within its walls. Richter has to crawl into his like a gopher." The arguments were rooted in their experience, in the common sense of a forested, temperate world. High ceilings were a mark of prosperity and allowed heat to rise. Large windows brought in light and air. A house stood on the land, not in it. They saw Klaus's creation as a regression, a primitive and fearful burrowing that flew in the face of progress. Klaus persisted through the autumn haze, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He chinked the interior of his stone walls with a final layer of smooth clay. He built simple, sturdy furniture from scrap lumber. He installed his small, efficient stove on a stone hearth, ensuring the chimney had a powerful draw. He offered only one quiet rebuttal during the entire construction. When Thorne loudly proclaimed that he would simply cut more wood to feed his own massive fireplace, Klaus, who was splitting his modest woodpile, paused. "Your fire will warm the sky, Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice even and calm. "My fire will warm my family." He then stacked another piece of cottonwood onto a pile that was conspicuously, almost absurdly, small for a Dakota winter. He was ready. He had built not a house, but a system for survival, a quiet alliance with the very earth his neighbors sought to conquer. The morning of January 12th, 1888, dawned with a strange and treacherous calm. A thaw had settled over the plains, and the temperature hovered just above freezing. The sun shone from a hazy, milky sky, and the snow that had fallen in previous weeks began to melt, creating a deceptive illusion of spring. Children, released from their cabins by the mild weather, were sent to school. Farmers, like Marcus Thorne, took the opportunity to bring in the last of their livestock from the fields, their breath pluming in the damp air. There was no warning, no ominous darkening of the horizon. The apocalypse arrived in an instant. Around midday, a sound began to build from the northwest, a low hum that grew into a deep, guttural roar. It was the sound of a wall of air, a polar vortex that had descended from the Arctic, moving at over 60 miles per hour. With it came a tidal wave of snow, not falling from the sky but driven horizontally, a blinding, scouring blizzard of ice particles. The temperature plummeted with breathtaking speed. In a matter of minutes, it dropped from 34 degrees Fahrenheit to 20 below zero, and it continued to fall. The sky vanished. The world was reduced to a screaming white chaos. Men caught outdoors were flash frozen where they stood. Children, trying to make their way home from school, became lost and disoriented within feet of their own doors. Inside Marcus Thorne's proud two-story log house, the storm's arrival was an assault. The wind hit the tall north wall with the force of a physical blow, and the entire structure groaned in protest. A fine, crystalline powder of snow began to jet through minuscule cracks in the chinking, coating the interior walls with a layer of frost. The high vaulted ceiling of his main room, once a symbol of his prosperity, became his greatest enemy. The heat from his enormous stone fireplace, which devoured logs at an alarming rate, rose uselessly into the rafters, while a bone-chilling cold pooled at floor level. His wife, Sarah, huddled with their infant son, wrapping him in every blanket they owned. But his small cries grew weaker, his skin taking on a dreadful bluish tint. The windows were completely plastered with a thick glass-like ice, plunging the room into a terrifying twilight. The roar of the wind was a constant, deafening presence, punctuated by the shriek of drafts that seemed to come from every direction at once. Thorne fought a desperate, losing battle. He stuffed rags into the window frames and door jambs, but the cold infiltrated relentlessly. His massive woodpile, stacked neatly against the north side of the house for convenience, was now buried under a 10-foot drift of snow as hard as concrete. He had only brought a day's worth of wood inside. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature inside the cabin, even a few feet from the roaring fire, dropped to the freezing point. The physics of failure were undeniable. The vast surface area of his tall walls and steep roof acted as a giant, inefficient radiator, bleeding heat into the storm. The high ceilings created a classic convection cycle, pulling cold air across the floor and sending precious warmth to a place where no one could feel it. His home was not a shelter, it was a sieve. Less than 100 yards away, inside Klaus Richter's buried home, the world was entirely different. The first indication of the storm was not a sound, but a sudden dimming of the light from his small south-facing windows as the snow began to fly. There was no roar, no shriek of wind. The tons of earth, sod, and stone that formed his roof absorbed the sound, reducing the blizzard's fury to a distant, muffled whisper. The silence was profound, the single most defining feature of his sanctuary. His small cast-iron stove glowed with a steady, contained heat, consuming a single, small log every hour. The air inside was cool, but comfortable and utterly still. His ingenious cold sink at the entrance was doing its job perfectly. Any sliver of cold air that found its way past the heavy door simply fell into the pit and stayed there, displaced by the warmer air in the main room. The stone walls, cool to the touch, were not leaching heat from the room. Instead, they were slowly radiating the warmth they had been accumulating for weeks, a steady, gentle energy that kept the ambient temperature stable. The earth surrounding his shelter still holding its 45-degree warmth, was not an enemy to be fought, but an ally, a massive insulating blanket that drastically reduced the thermal load. Klaus sat at his small wooden table, calmly oiling a piece of leather harness. The physics of his success were as elegant as his neighbor's failure was brutal. Low interior volume meant less air to heat. The immense insulation of the Earth provided an R value that modern engineers would marvel at. The aerodynamic profile presented nothing for the wind to grab. His home was not fighting the storm, it was ignoring it. As the blizzard raged into its first night, Klaus remained methodical. He was not merely surviving, he was collecting data. He had one of the few reliable thermometers in the settlement, a German-made instrument he treated with great care. Every hour he would unlatch his heavy door, hold the thermometer out into the maelstrom for precisely 60 seconds, and then quickly retreat into the calm of his shelter. The mercury dropped to a terrifying -35 degrees, and then -40, before it bottomed out against the bulb. He recorded the readings in a small leather-bound ledger. Beside the column for the outside temperature, he recorded the inside temperature. It never wavered from a steady 58 degrees. He also kept a precise record of his fuel consumption. He had arranged his small supply of firewood into neat, countable stacks. By his calculation, he was using 1/10 of the wood that Marcus Thorne would need to burn just to keep his own house above freezing, a feat Thorne was now failing to achieve. Klaus performed a simple test, lighting a splinter of wood and holding it near the floor and window seals. The flame barely flickered. There were no drafts. His shelter was a sealed, stable, and efficient system. This was not luck. This was the result of observation, tradition, and a deep respect for the overwhelming power of nature. His vindication was not a feeling of smug satisfaction, but the quiet, empirical truth written in the columns of his ledger. The second day of the blizzard brought desperation to the surface. The wind had not slackened, and the snow had piled into monstrous sculptural drifts that buried fences and reached the eaves of the settlers' cabins. Inside the Thorne house, the situation had become critical. They had run out of firewood just after dawn. In a panic, Marcus had first broken up a wooden crate, then a spare chair. The small, quick-burning pieces of furniture provided fleeting warmth but did little to combat the pervasive, deadly cold. The baby was now listless, wrapped in a cocoon of frost-stiffened blankets. Sarah Thorne's face was a mask of fear, her own breath crystallizing in the air before her. They were freezing to death in the very home that was meant to be their fortress. Sometime in the late afternoon, a sound came from outside their door, a frantic, muffled pounding. It was another neighbor, a man named Henderson, his face covered in ice, who had made a desperate, crawling journey from his own cabin, where his elderly parents were succumbing to the cold. Their fire was out. They were dying. Thorne, his arrogance shattered by the brutal reality of the storm, knew there was only one place to go: the fool's house, the gopher hole, the grave. It was their only hope. Bundling his child and wife and supporting the half-frozen Henderson, Thorne stumbled out into the white hell. They could not see more than 2 feet in front of them, navigating by memory and sheer will, the wind tearing the breath from their lungs. The knock on Klaus Richter's door was faint, almost lost in the muffled roar that was the only evidence of the storm outside. Klaus opened the heavy, insulated door to a scene of utter desperation. Marcus Thorne, the proud man who had mocked him relentlessly, stood there, his beard a solid mass of ice, his face a patchwork of white frostbite. In his arms, he cradled his wife and child, both barely conscious. Klaus did not hesitate. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not pause for a moment of triumph. He simply stood aside and ushered them in. The transition was staggering. From the shrieking -40-degree chaos, they stumbled into a world of profound stillness and steady, gentle warmth. The air was breathable, not a weapon that froze the lungs. The silence was the most shocking part. Thorn looked around the small, simple room, illuminated by the warm, steady glow of a single kerosene lamp. He saw the small, efficient stove, the neat pile of wood, the utter lack of frost on the deep-set windows. His baby, held now by Klaus's wife, began to stir, a faint whimper replacing the terrifying silence. Sarah Thorn collapsed onto a stool, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall, overwhelmed by the sudden, incomprehensible safety. After a few minutes of stunned silence, as the life-giving warmth began to penetrate his frozen limbs, Marcus Thorn, a man broken and humbled, looked at Klaus. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "How?" he asked. It was not a challenge, but a plea for understanding. He gestured around the room. "There is no wind. How is there no wind inside?" Klaus, who was ladling warm broth into a bowl, answered with the simple, direct language of physics. "The house is in the earth, not on it. The wind does not see it. It passes over." He pointed to the entrance. "The cold air is heavier. It falls into the pit by the door and stays there. It cannot climb into the room." Thorn stared, his mind slowly grasping a concept so alien to his own way of thinking. He had built a fortress to fight the winter. Klaus had built a partnership with the earth. One had failed, the other had succeeded. In that moment of quiet explanation, surrounded by the life-saving warmth of the buried shelter, the skeptic's world was remade. He was no longer a mocker. He was a student. Klaus Richter acted with a quiet grace that was more powerful than any boast. He and his wife tended to the frostbite of their new guests, shared their modest but plentiful food, and made a warm place for the Thorn infant to sleep. There was no self-congratulation in his manner, no hint of vindication. He simply did what was necessary, his actions dictated by a deep-seated humanity. He was not a savior gloating over the saved. He was a craftsman whose work had performed as designed. His satisfaction was not in being right, but in being prepared. His shelter, built on principles of humility and observation, had become an ark in the frozen flood, and he welcomed all who came to it without judgment, sharing the warmth he had so carefully cultivated. When the great blizzard finally broke after 3 days of unrelenting fury, it revealed a landscape transformed and a community shattered. The world was buried under a sea of white, with drifts so high they had completely covered some smaller cabins. The human cost was devastating. Families across the territory were discovered frozen in their homes, victims of failed fires and relentless drafts. The story of the schoolhouse blizzard would be written in tragedy, a litany of those lost trying to make their way home, or succumbing to the cold in houses that offered no real protection. But in the small settlement of Prairie Ridge, a different story began to circulate, a story of survival centered on the most unlikely of structures. The tale of how Marcus Thorn and his family, along with several others who had found their way to the dugout, had ridden out the storm in quiet warmth spread like wildfire. In the weeks that followed, a steady stream of neighbors made their way to Klaus Richter's home. They did not come to mock. They came to learn. They would stand in the entryway, stooping to enter, and marvel at the stillness and the ambient warmth that persisted even with a low fire. Marcus Thorne, now Klaus's most fervent advocate, became his unlikely interpreter. "You see," he would explain to the others, his voice filled with the passion of a new convert. "He doesn't fight the wind. He hides from it. The heat doesn't escape to the ceiling. There is no ceiling to escape to." Men who had once laughed at Klaus's methods now came to him with notepads and pencils, asking for specific dimensions, for advice on stone laying and sod cutting. Klaus, patient and generous, shared his knowledge freely. He didn't offer to build for them, but to teach them. He walked them through the principles, the importance of the southern exposure, the function of the cold sink, the correct thickness of the earthen roof for proper insulation. He explained that his design was not the only design. It was a set of principles that could be adapted. That summer, a new kind of construction began in Prairie Ridge. Few went so far as to build a complete underground dwelling like Klaus's. Instead, they began to implement his ideas in hybrid forms. Many, including Thorne, excavated deep, stone-lined cellars adjacent to their existing cabins, connected by an insulated underground passage. These winter rooms became the family's primary living space during the coldest months. They retrofitted their homes, adding sod insulation to their roofs and building earthen berms against their north walls to deflect the wind and borrow warmth from the ground. They learned to build lower, to value thermal mass over grand appearances, and to see the earth not as something to be conquered, but as a resource to be utilized. The following winter served as the ultimate proof. The community's consumption of firewood dropped by nearly half. The retrofitted homes were demonstrably warmer, with families able to maintain comfortable temperatures without having to huddle constantly around a roaring fire. Most tellingly, the health of the community improved. The doctor from the nearest town noted a dramatic decrease in cases of pneumonia and severe frostbite. Infants and the elderly, who had been the most vulnerable, now survived the winter in greater numbers. The practical wisdom of the quiet Swiss immigrant had not only been vindicated, it had been woven into the fabric of the community, becoming the new common sense. The foolish hole in the ground had become the blueprint for survival on the northern plains. The legacy of Klaus Richter's buried stone roof shelter extended far beyond the boundaries of Prairie Ridge. The schoolteacher, Ilara Vance, who had also taken refuge in the dugout during the storm, had meticulously documented Klaus's design and the underlying principles he had explained. She sent a detailed letter, complete with sketches, to her brother, a journalist in Chicago. He, in turn, wrote a feature article for a popular national magazine about the Dakota Dugout, a new form of frontier architecture born of ancient wisdom and tested by one of history's most ferocious storms. The idea spread, adopted by homesteaders across the northern plains and into Canada, who recognized the simple, profound logic of the design. It became a part of the vernacular architecture of the region, a testament to the power of adapting to, rather than fighting against, one's environment. Modern building science would eventually give formal names to the principles Klaus Richter knew instinctively. His use of the Earth's stable temperature is the basis for modern earth-sheltered and passive house construction. The thick, sod-covered roof was a super-insulated assembly with an R value far exceeding that of a conventional log or plank roof. His understanding of thermal mass, the ability of the stone and earth to store and radiate heat, is now a cornerstone of energy-efficient design. The cold sink at the entrance was a brilliant, simple application of thermodynamics, preventing cold air infiltration more effectively than the most advanced modern weather stripping. Klaus Richter had, without formal training, engineered a high-performance home, proving that advanced concepts are often rooted in the simplest observations. The story of the buried shelter serves as a powerful parable. It is a reminder that conventional wisdom is often just that, conventional, not wise. It champions the quiet innovator, the individual who trusts observation and inherited knowledge over popular opinion and prevailing trends. In an age that often prizes height and appearance over function and efficiency, the tale of the man who dug down while others built up speaks a timeless truth about the nature of survival. It reminds us that true strength is not found in defiance of the natural world, but in a humble and intelligent partnership with it. For in the heart of the unforgiving prairie, under the relentless assault of the Arctic wind, the greatest fortress was not the one that stood tallest against the sky, but the one that had the wisdom to disappear, drawing its warmth and its profound silence from the slow, steady heart of the earth itself.